All right, so we'll now move on to more of a kind of like new part of the jury trial system, right? Because we know that pretrial exists, and there are a lot of different ways that we can handle it, but there's also a system that we consider once someone actually gets a trial. And so we'll kind of consider just for just for a little flavor to add a little bit. We'll talk a little bit. I read this in the newspaper today, so that's where we're picking up. And this is a story about the if my pen's working, which it isn't. Now it is. The NXVIM sex cult. This was in the New York Times today. So let's before we get going, let's talk a little bit about what was going on, right? So there's this guy, his name's Keith Raniere. I think that's how it's Raniere, right? And so what Keith ended up happening, right, is he had this brilliant plan he had a bunch of self-help, self-improvement courses. And he often targeted educated, wealthy people. So but what he ended up doing was preying upon their insecurities. So he would say, "Hey, I know you're feeling real done. Wouldn't it be a shame if that got worse? Maybe you're not doing so well. Maybe you need some extra treatment. I might be able to help you." And so what was his big plot here, right? So he's at the center of this, right? That he's this person that can help all of you. He can help, give you aid, can give you, information. He can help you all of that. Basically what he would do, right, is that he would be here in his little compound, and then he would direct associates or other people, and he would be like, "Hey, you associate, you're now with me." And then same thing with this other associate. And this other associate, would also come in. Now, whether they participate in their programs, maybe it was their family members, but basically what he would do is that he would, that's too dark. He would enlist, young people who are vulnerable, so young people who are wealthy, and then also ask members for their young children. And basically would ask them to submit to him in some form, sort of a harem situation, and basically would get into a sex trafficking kind of business. Also, sexual assault, rape of these young girls, right? He would also do something where he would make members give sexually explicit videos of themselves. And what they would do is basically he would hold it as a blackmail. If you ever betray me or if you're ever not loyal, I need to test your loyalty. Give me this sexually explicit video, then hold that over the person as well. In some cases, he would also burn his initials into the skin of victims or members without anesthesia, and as to mark them as his. What a swell guy, right? I mean, he obviously charismatic. I mean, who wouldn't want to be sold into a sex trade and raped and then have your initials burned into you, and then if you ever leave, you threaten to release sexual content of you, revenge porn kind of stuff, right? Who wouldn't want to be that? What a swell guy. So we have this. That's sarcasm, right? Obviously, incredibly heinous, monstrous kind of allegations and crimes, right? But what this illustrates, right, is that there are a lot of things that are happening here, and these are very egregious, very unusual, very emotionally charging, destroying kind of things, right? So the potential that it has an impact on the court system and how going through it, right? Because it'd be very easy in the olden times, right, to go through and maybe you would lynch this person or exile them in some way, right? At the same time, right, there's also questions about how the government got into the investigation, what rights does someone have for these allegations, because until they're proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law, they really aren't anything, right? So what ends up happening in this kind of situation, right? So, prior to all this, right, we rely on police to investigate, and like look into crimes, right? And maybe they'll go through, they have to make sure that they're meeting searches and seizures and stuff like that. But across this point, right, we get to first, there's the actual plea hearing, where you submit your plea if you're guilty or not. Bail is set. You decide. There's a determination if you can meet it, you can stay in prison. If not, you go out. And we get into something where we are looking into a trial, right? Because while it would be easy to just like kind of plead down, this is a really high stakes matter, and people are looking for justice and to have these crimes publicly exposed. And so it'd be really hard for like a plea or negotiation on that front to occur, right? So what would we do then? This is also like really important because, if there aren't any witnesses or if there aren't witnessing accusers, then, it's possible that these are all made up. And, for a long time in trials, you wouldn't have the ability to face your accusers. You couldn't, you could also be kind of like drugged up or mentally disabled, right? And people could bring up charges against you. Maybe you would ask for witnesses, but they wouldn't show up, and then you're convicted anyway. So there's a lot of trial rights that are in place, even though these crimes are very serious allegations that are put in place to protect the rights of everyone, including the accused, because it could be true that they did not commit a crime, right? And so the other part to continue, right, if we think about this kind of case, right, is that, you want to have a speedy trial so that everyone has like a better memory, and you don't want to have wait a long time in prison. You kind of want to avoid publicity by dragging it out, but, because if it's on display, you could end up biasing your jury pool. But the point being is that there's a lot of processes. So after this point, right, so if we had like this little timeline that kind of came up, right, we know, right, that there are, at some point, these crimes like occur, right? And then along this time, the police do their investigation, and they make an arrest decision that is based off of probable cause. They've investigated, they followed all the proper rules, dotted all the I's and crossed the T's and stuff like that. And formally have a hearing where charges are raised against someone, right? At that point, once a hearing is brought up, once the charges are set before the court, right, there's and everything's going into place, we move into this trial period, after which there's a trial, there is the sentencing phase. So when we think about what happens in a trial, right, there's a lot of things that occur related to this, right? So the first is going to be, right, is that there is jury selection. So before the actual trial begins, people end up selecting who's going to be on it. Because what you want to try to do, in theory, is to be judged by, your peers and people who are going to be impartial and fair and listen to it. And that's really not true, because both the prosecution and, defendant are going to try to stack the jury in such a way to have a favorable outcome, right? But we'll go with that they can, now you can strike people because they actually have a bias or a predisposition to something and strike for cause, or you can use something called a peremptory challenge, where you don't have to disclose the reason for why someone was struck from a jury pool. Once the jury is selected and all the alternates are put into place, right, there's typically a preview of the arguments. So the prosecutors can be like, hey, here's what's going on. We believe this person, so in this case, the Nexivum sex cult, this guy was branding people, he was raping them, he was doing all these terrible, nasty things, and we're going to demonstrate, what's going on. The defense will also make a statement about like, hey, our client really isn't that kind of guy. He didn't really do these things, or it's a misunderstanding. All this was like fair, and so on, right? Once that point like comes into place, right, the prosecutor goes about making their statement. So the prosecutor is going to start calling witnesses, and they're going to corroborate a story. They're going to introduce and detail the minutia and details in this, right? So the defense is going to be able to challenge witnesses. They're going to be able to ask questions of, about the evidence that's being put into place. They're going to do like everything they can to kind of disrupt it. But the prosecution's going to be like, here's why we think this person committed those crimes. After that point, the defense has the shot to show up. They're going to be basically like, here's why the prosecution, in some ways, like they're going to make an appeal to about the prosecution, say what's wrong. They'll also introduce evidence and witnesses that could possibly exonerate, their client from future crimes, right? So once that's put into place, the prosecution also has a chance to, make a statement to question the defense, all the evidence and stuff like that. But then we transition into closing arguments. And these closing arguments are basically going to kind of sum up and wrap up for the jury why someone may be innocent or why someone may be guilty of their crime, right? And they sort of make this last appeal about maybe like how the jury should vote. So should you vote that this person's guilty on X charge, or should you vote that they're not guilty on these other charges, and so on, right? There's a lot of different ways like, this can break, right? After presenting all this different evidence, right, we then move into the actual deliberation. So, the jury is supposed to meet with themselves. They're not supposed to consult anyone else. In many cases, they really can't ask for outside evidence, right? So they can't be like, hey, what defense team, what do you think about this? They're kind of left alone. And throughout the entire trial process, they're really sequestered from the outside world in order to limit any undue influence on them. Once these deliberations take place, the judge is then going to, read out this, make a sentence of judgment after reading out the jury's decision, right? And so, because even though that, the jury finds them guilty, ultimately the punishment comes from the judge, and depending on what it is, that could be, maybe it's just like a probation kind of thing, maybe it's hardly anything, it's just community service, or extremely long prison sentence, right? After the sentence goes into place, there can also be the appeal process where you make an appeal that the trial process was flawed in some way. So when we think about this case that I was sort of telling you about, right, a lot of the deliberation stuff is going to be important because people are going to be like, well, did he really do it? How bad is it if he brains people? Did he actually sexually assault people, or did like that person give consent? Do you believe or not believe the story, right? And is there really, enough evidence here to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime, right? So in this case, when we think about proof beyond a reasonable doubt, you'd be like 95% sure someone did something, right? You have to be convinced at that point is typically like the shorthand for that. Although that could be different depending on the case, but in criminal cases, 95% sure. And so with this verdict that comes in, you have the potential to dramatically alter someone's life. This dude, who was branding and running sex trafficking and had a harem of young women that he was sexually assaulting all the time, effectively has a life sentence. He has 120 years in prison staring him down, right? But, for this kind of thing, though, the serious allegations, we have this trial process in place, right, in order to protect people and potentially innocent from being victimized by the government. And we have, this sort of process in place to really try to test the government, right? Because rather than just, we used to live in a system where we used to have judges who would just like issue sentences. There was no due process. There was no introduction of facts. Basically, once you were, suspected, like you were like kind of like screwed, right? So having this long drawn out process is in the interest of checking the power of the government and to make sure that, evidence is being heard, that someone has a fair shake. And I think that's really probably like the most important part of the judicial process in this. So with that, we'll end the video.